Welcome guys to the first ever video of DataSolve, and in this video I'm going to be giving you a detailed breakdown of how to integrate Supabase and the Bubble API connector. Before we begin, yes, I need to promote my own services. So my name's Christian Lofts and I'm from datasolve.tech. We specialize in database creation, database maintenance, database migration, and we also create front-end web apps. I'm going to give you a demonstration in this video, and I'm going to, explain to you in practical advice how to integrate your Supabase backend to your Bubble front end. Without further ado, let's jump into today's video. Alright guys, so before we jump into today's video, it's always helpful to build up the context, get a bit of background information into what exactly are we doing. So we'll start with understanding what Supabase is. In essence, Supabase is a BaaS, backend as a service, and why would we be using Supabase? So my use case for using Supabase is that I have a SQL database which is quite complex in nature, and it doesn't really suit the compatibility for the Bubble default database. I have a lot of functions, a lot of complex views, hence I need to rely on this the functionality of Postgres to be able to satisfy my requirements. Hence I'm using Supabase. Now, the beauty about Supabase is that it provides an API endpoint for the Bubble API connector to integrate with. It works relatively seamlessly. There is a few technical things that you need to go through to get it working properly. We'll go through that in today's video. But that's kind of explaining the Supabase in a nutshell. Now, if we move on to Bubble, in effect, I've opened up the documentation here. So this is, you can read this in your own time if you feel free. So we can see here the Bubble app makes an outgoing API call to an external app. In this case, it's Supabase, and it will provide a response. Pretty simple, pretty easy to understand. You also need to have an understanding of this get, post, batch, and delete methods, HTTP requests, because they all have different, functionality in terms of the database. So using ChatGPT, if you want to, internalize the meanings of these methods, the easiest way in database context, a get would be a select, post would be an insert, put would be an update, a patch would be an update with partial modifications, delete, so on, so forth. So I guess that's the context of the video. I've kind of given you a bit of context in Supabase and in Bubble. Now we're going to move on into the practical side. How do we actually integrate Supabase into the Bubble API connector? There's a bit of mucking around and toing and froing, but we're going to get to the end result. So I'm going to start with my Supabase login. So I've logged into my account here. I'd recommend using a public schema, because what it means is we don't need to, grant permissions by default, or there's less settings we need to change. But in the case we are using a custom schema, we've created this custom schema, you will need to follow these instructions to grant, authentication to users. Failing to do so will result in failure if you do not follow these instructions. If you follow my blog, I actually give you a curl script which you can import straight away. Now, if you want to expose your schema, you just need to click on Project Settings, click on API, and then you would scroll down the bottom and you should see exposed schemas there. The next step is we need to configure the plugin. We need to configure the API connector plugin. So you would need to add an API here. I'm not going to go too in depth on what exactly the step-by-step functionality here. I'm just going to show you what I've done and you can copy that. But I'm going to start with, I've got a few calls here in my client application here. This is based off the back end of my real working application. Yes, we do design web apps. If you're interested, you can get in touch with me. Other than that, we're going to start with this simple get response. So what this is doing is it's integrated with this view that I've created, and this effectively returns the table name. And because I've used a custom schema, I also need to provide this header accept profile. Failing to do so will cause an error, or it will not work. So to finalize your API call, you would just click on this reinitialize call, or in your case, you may have initialize call. So you click on that, and Bubble will actually read the JSON formatted from Supabase. So here, if we click on show raw data, we can see the actual raw data. And these are all the columns that we're returning. And now we can call that into our elements, or we can use these as data sources in our Bubble backend, if you will. And to finalize, we just click on save. Pretty self-explanatory. And if you keep watching, I'll show you a more advanced example in the next scenario. So that's pretty simple. And if you copy these settings, you should be able to get your Supabase to work. Where it gets a bit trickier is when you're calling a function in Supabase. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. And if you're passing in parameters. Okay, so before I go into the explanation of what this return table data is, I'm going to show you a demonstration of what it's actually doing. Maybe it might give you a bit of better understanding. So please excuse the, lack of design. This is just a feature I'm working on in my commercial application. So this is a call to an API. This is basically returning all the data agreements. I've got a view. So if I click submit, it's going to give me all the details for that data agreement. This is the ID, etc., etc. Now up the top here, this is a dynamic call to, a view I've created, and these are classifications. So let's say we want to look at the rates. Now these are all tables classified under rates. So let's say we want, and this is, mind you, this is all under the data agreement 21. It's all specified in the backend workflow. So if we click on rates, this will bring up all the rates for this data agreement. So you can see rate ID 19, 20. Now, hopefully that provides a bit more context into why I've created this return table data. Because as you can see here, we're passing these arguments, data agreement and dim rates. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense there. We've got the parameters, we're passing the table name. Now, your use case may differ to mine, but this is just a bit more of a complex API call. All right, guys, so I'm going to show you the function that I call where I pass in parameters in Supabase. So it's called return table data. And if we look at the edit, so effectively I'm passing in, it's a dynamic, it creates a dynamic SQL. It's calling in the table name and the data agreement ID. And this will just return the data pertaining to that ID in a dynamic fashion. Now, the tricky part to understand about this is we need to provide a manual JSON if we want to call different columns. It's kind of a bit confusing to understand at first, but let's say you want to call these columns in your Bubble interface, but when you make the API call, we're only getting the values from dim rates. So how does Bubble know to pull in the rest? So this is where you need to manually enter in your JSON if you want to get these other columns. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because you need to make sure, so this is what I'm showing you now is an example of my JSON. So this is what Supabase returns. So what I did is I created another function which would return the JSON from my Supabase. So I believe it's called function return all data. And what this is used to initialize the JSON. So this is also another dynamic SQL, and it will return the first row of each table. I've got a copy of this script on my blog, so you can actually have a look at that. So just to summarize everything, I've got two functions. One is the actual function I'm using, and the other function is calls the JSON to initialize the API call. So as you can see here, I have to manually enter this API response in order for the API call to work properly, and I can pull in all the columns. Hopefully that makes sense. As you can see here, I've got this is passing the parameters here. Please leave a comment if it doesn't make sense, or if it does, great. The next, and I guess here we go, the next API call that we are making is a post. Now, the post, acts as an update in this context. And I'm going to show you the live example. I'm going to update this value, and I'm going to show you what it looks like in the backend in Supabase. So we're going to update this. So this is data agreement 21, rate ID 19. So we're going to update this. It was 54.12. So we'll just update it 54.13. Save. This will give you a confirmation message, and click yes. One row updated successfully. So we should now see 54.13 in the database. There we go. It just changed there, 54.13. So let's change that back because we don't need that. So I guess this is an example of a post. I've created a lot of state variables, which I need to call. It gets a bit complicated. You can copy this in your own time. Just to summarize the video, when you're building things in Supabase, it's probably easier to use the public schema. Make sure you follow the naming conventions, which is lowercase. Everything is lowercase, and replace the spaces with underscores. The next step is you can copy my settings to initialize your API connector, and you can play around and test that. Also, if you want to use the API connector as an action, which means we call it in the workflow, you need to be aware that you will need to initialize the JSON under the bubble API connector, which I showed you previously, and you need to make sure your JSON is validated. Please reach out if you have any issues, and hopefully you've found this video entertaining or interesting or all of the above, and thank you for watching.